Hello. Okay.
Hi, Rabio. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, am I muted?
No, I can hear you. Sounds good.
Okay, good.
All right. Okay, welcome everybody who's joining. We'll give it another minute or two. Can see lots of you are already here, which is great. Okay, thanks everyone for joining. Looks like we have over 100 people here, which is excellent. So we'll get started. This is being recorded. So if those who've joined a little bit late, they can always access the webinar. But welcome. So hi, everyone. We're going to get started now. And today's webinar is Newcomer Housing Tips, Cultivating Landlord Relationships for Long-Term Housing. This is presented by Switchboard, which is part of IRC, a great resource hub for all things resettlement related. I'm Joshua Weber with Refugee Housing Solutions, and we have Michael and Rabio with NeighborWorks Boise and other experience at IRC Boise. So we're going to introduce them later, but now we're going to just move forward, just kind of setting the stage with the webinar. Okay, so here's a quick overview of our Zoom, the settings in Zoom. This is a Zoom webinar, so you'll be joining on listen mode only. You may switch your audio between your computer and phone at any time under audio settings in the lower left corner of your screen. Due to the large number of learners on today's webinar, we've disabled the chat box. However, you do have the option to send messages to the speakers and co-facilitators via the Q&A. Keep an eye on the chat for messages from Switchboard and links to various resources we'll be mentioning throughout. Lastly, I'd like to mention that today's session will run for 60 minutes and is being recorded. You'll receive an email with the recording, slides, and recommended resources within 24 hours. The webinar transcript, along with the recording, will also be posted on the Switchboard website within the following days. Okay. Like I said, I'll briefly introduce myself and the panelists. So my name is Joshua Weber, and I'm the Associate Director at Refugee Housing Solutions with CWS, Church World Service. I will be facilitating the webinar today and the Q&A answer portion of the webinar that will start shortly. Our two panelists today come from the Boise, Idaho area and have extensive experience working with refugees and newcomer in the housing space. They are Michael Shepard and Rabio Manzo. We thank them for their time today. We're excited to talk to them a little bit later. But then a little bit later, before we get to the Q&A, I'll let them introduce themselves and their background, because I know I won't do it justice. So we'll come back to them in a little, very shortly. Okay, great. Very briefly, we'd like to introduce you to NeighborWorks Boise, whose work we'll be highlighting throughout our session today. NeighborWorks is a national organization whose mission is to create innovative housing solutions for underserved populations through strategic partnerships that contribute to building stronger communities. There are 247 NeighborWorks offices across the US. Okay. NeighborWorks Boise Apartment Rentals program provides low-income housing, addressing the growing demand caused by a housing boom and market and limited housing stock, which is also occurring nationwide. Currently, there are refugees being housed through this program. And this slide is just some numbers of the great work that they do. And just all the different kinds of programs that they have. Like I said, I'm going to hand this over to Michael shortly because I'm not going to do it justice, but it's a great organization. Okay, so our learning objectives for today, hopefully, will be that we can explain the benefits of helping newcomers build good landlord-tenant relationships. In addition to this, we're going to name steps for identifying and establishing collaborative partnerships that will develop or expand these landlord relationships. We're also going to apply insights from affordable housing experts on how to cultivate landlord relationships and long-term housing. We're going to talk about real-world successes and ways that we can strategically apply these things to the real world in housing. Okay, so much of today will consist of Q&A. But before we get into that, we have some brief slides we're going to walk through to kind of set the stage for the discussion and provide some areas for working to support refugees accessing housing during the resettlement process. So let's get started. We'll kick things off by looking at some benefits of helping newcomers build strong landlord relationships. And we're going to do this first. We have a poll that we'd like you to take. So I think Yasmin can pull up the poll. Okay, so the question is, does your organization have documented strategies for relationship building with tenants and landlords? So this we can kind of take the temperature and see where everyone's at. Give everybody a minute. Okay, great. Okay, people are still filling it out, but we're at about 160 people have filled it out, and we've got 38% are leaning more toward no, they don't have those strategic documents, but they are interested in learning more. That's excellent. Okay, great. All right, great. So that's good. Hopefully we can help shed some light on that. And as we get started, I'll say one of the great things about having kind of strategy documents prepared is that it really helps in setting expectations, but we can come back to that in a little bit. Okay, great. So like I said, we're going to just very briefly go through some slides and kind of set the stage. So understanding of the landlord's perspective, this is key. Generally, owners or landlords have one primary goal with rental properties. They want to make a profit from their investment. Underlying that goal are three primary objectives that affect the tenant selection process. One is maximizing the rents to be collected in full and on time. Two is minimizing future expenditures for repairs, damages, etc. And the third is minimizing complaints from neighboring tenants or creating other issues. Understanding this perspective can help align your talking points with the landlord's priorities when it comes to benefits to renting to newcomers and refugees. Okay. We have a version of the SMART model. I know many people are familiar with this, but we have our version. It's a model that outlines the benefits for landlords of not only renting to refugees and newcomers, but for resettlement agencies and maintaining these strong relationships. In addition to the benefits listed here, which I'll go through briefly, maintaining these relationships can help landlords with many other benefits. So specifically, landlords support their community by offering affordable housing options to refugees. They don't need to advertise vacancies in the same way if they have strong relationships with resettlement agencies and have tenants for available units. Newcomer tenants and refugee tenants come oftentimes with case manager support, which can be vital to navigating that process. Landlords also will receive timely rent payments from the organization placing the refugee tenant. So I know different organizations have different ways of managing this, but they have very high rates of timely rent payments. And then also they always have a tenant for the unit and they decrease vacancies. So that's also a very significant benefit to landlords and property management companies. Okay, so next question, we have another quick poll. So based on this short list, what would you say from the model, which benefits do you think would be most useful to emphasize when building relationships with landlords? So is it supporting them. So landlords have more engagement with the community, supporting that, decreased marketing, the case manager being part of the process, timely rent payments, or just decreasing vacancy and always having tenants based on that relationship. Okay, great. All right, we're about halfway there with the respondents. Looks good. Okay, great. We're at about 150. We'll give everybody just another couple of seconds. I know this is a little bit more of a detailed question, so I'm sure people are thinking. Okay, starting to slow down. So I would say we've got about 50% of you are saying that timely rent payments is what you would say is, from the landlord perspective, the most important. That's definitely a great answer. Okay, thanks. Okay, like I said, moving on. So beyond the obvious benefits to obtaining housing, there are some other benefits to newcomers and refugees about maintaining that strong relationship with their landlord or property owner. Here are a few. Number one, establishing a credit history. This is vital for long-term affordable housing access. Also, building a foundation in the new place and long-term success. So becoming part of that local community, building those relationships. That relationship with the landlord or property owner is really a big part of that. And enhancing that credibility for future housing. So, you know, as there's a kind of pathway forward to home ownership, if that's where they're going, building that relationship with their landlord or property owner is a key part of that process. Okay, so we're going to talk about very briefly some strategies on how to identify this. But like I said earlier, we're really going to dig into this during the Q&A. So we're just going to touch upon some very high-level ideas. When we mean collaborative partnership, which is ideally the relationship that you'd have with the landlord or property management company, what do we mean? For the purposes of this webinar, we're thinking of the term partnership referring to the relationship between the organization and the landlord. So this may be informal, it might be formal. They may or may not have an exchange of services or funds. It might be a collaborative relationship, but that's kind of how we're going to define it. Now, there are two kind of main breakoffs when we talk about partnership: the formal partnerships involving signed agreements, for example, memorandums of agreement or MOUs. And then we have less formal partnerships, informal partnerships, don't involve the signed agreement, but oftentimes are very strong relationships between landlords and resettlement agencies or the organizations that are supporting the newcomers or refugees. Okay, we have our last poll. Okay, so in general, how formal are the partnerships between the organization that you're with and the landlord or property management? So 1 would be very informal, 5 would be you have a very formal relationship with documentation, signed MOUs, that sort of thing. Okay, great. We've got about 150 people responded so far. That's excellent. Looks like middle of the ground. So we're getting a lot of 3s, but there's definitely a curve in this, which is great because there's benefits to informal and formal relationships. So that's good. Okay, just 3 more slides and then we're going to get to the Q&A. All right, so just very briefly, we'd like to give some concrete kind of steps that people can take to build those relationships with landlords in the space. So 1 is really determine your local needs. Understand kind of, you know, what if you have resettling refugees or working with newcomers, what's your case management, how many people are you working with, and really understand the challenges that you're facing in your local community and local housing market. The second is recruit the right people in organizations. So not only just formal recruitment, but informal volunteer recruitment, or those of the people in the community, the different kinds of stakeholders that are involved in this process. Bring in the right people and build those relationships. Another step would be to assess the resources needed. Oftentimes, we do a lot of technical assistance at Refugee Housing Solutions, and oftentimes we work with case managers who just have a lot of refugees that they're trying to support. So really try to find that balance with your resource and managing the needs. Next step is determine the goals and structure of the collaborative partnership. So, in this last poll, we just talked about the informal kind of hands-off approach of just kind of talking, all the way up to kind of managing those more formal MOU processes, and even to the point of helping leasing agreements and that sort of thing. I think it's good to determine beforehand that you're going into that space with a real plan of where you want the relationship to be. The next is to develop and agree on an action plan. So not just have a strategy, but a timeline. So this is something that we found is key for establishing expectations, both on the resettlement agency side and on the refugee or newcomer side. And then, just as important, working with that landlord. So really set key milestones, understand the timeline of how things are going to happen, and then develop that communication strategy. So really have that timeline in place before you develop your communication strategy, which we're going to talk about in a moment. And the next is monitor progress and risk. So, timeliness is important here, to check in on the process. Oftentimes in housing, it's not a one step into a long-term affordable housing situation. There are many milestones and a process that we kind of go through to support refugees as they resettle. And then the second is to celebrate successes. One of the things that we found that is very common is that when we have resettlement agencies with strong landlord relationships, part of that is bringing that landlord or property manager or property owner into the process and really celebrating things when they go well, and being part of that success. We find that really kind of sets the stage for long-term involvement and, for future refugees having access to those units. Okay, great. Last slide, and then we'll get to the Q&A. So, some common issues is really managing assumptions, expectations, and bias. You may need to re-emphasize to landlords that the refugees and newcomers are heavily vetted. They come complete with orientation, and they have support from your organization. Another thing is really advocating for clients while still maintaining that relationship. So you want to be a voice or an advocate for the refugee or newcomer, but remember that it's a negotiation process and mutually beneficial for everyone in the process. And we're looking for optimal outcome, which, is it's a dialogue, it's a back and forth. Okay, great. All right, so hopefully that was helpful. That's the kind of setting the stage for the discussion. From now to the end of the time that we have today, we're going to really kind of try to apply the insights of your work and everything that you do working around housing. And with our panelists, Michael and Rabio, we're going to really unpack this. So let's now move into our Q&A session. So we'll dive into the discussion, but I just wanted to say first is that we do have the opportunity to take questions from you all. This is the best part of this. So feel free to go into the chat, and we will monitor the chat. And if you have a question that you'd like to ask to the panelists, put it in there. We'll have a couple of minutes now where they'll introduce themselves. So we'll have a chance for people to get the chat populated with some great questions. And once they're done with their introductions, we'll move right into that. Okay, cool. So this would be a great time for the panelists to provide that brief background. And, if they could, I'll ask them to just kind of talk about how they got into this space and their background. And also, when they start to think about working with refugees to access long-term affordable housing, what specifically do they think are the most important aspects of this discussion? And I'll leave it at that. So first, I'll let Michael Shepard introduce himself and talk to us about his background, and then we can have Rabio, and then we'll get to the Q&A.
Great, thanks, Joshua. My name is Michael Shepard, and I'm the Rehab Asset Manager for NeighborWorks Boise. We are a small affordable housing nonprofit. We have 282 units of affordable housing. I know that we probably have over 25 languages spoken between our 5 larger apartment complexes. But NeighborWorks, been involved with them for over 30 years. I was a banker by trade and got involved with NeighborWorks about 30 years ago, sitting on one of their committees. And then I just fell in love with what they did. I was on their board for a while. I was their board president. And then in 2012, they asked me to come and work for them. So I oversee all of our affordable housing units, and we have a lending department, we have counseling departments. So we really are a full service affordable housing provider. We like our renters to be educated. We want them to be successful. We want them to be able to move out of affordable housing, even into market rate housing, and or even own a home at some point. So I appreciate you. I appreciate being here today.
Okay, great. Thanks, Michael. And Rabio, just briefly introduce yourself and then we can get to some questions.
Sure. Thank you, Joshua. My name is Rabiu Manzo, and I'm the immigration coordinator here at the International Rescue Committee in Boise. And I've been working with Refugee for the last 17 years at different capacity. My background, I came from animal husbandry background, but because of my languages, they pulled me in to working with refugees since 2006. So as a case manager supervisor, so I did a lot of housing, and now I provide immigration services for not only refugees, but also immigrants. So
Okay,
thank you.
Michael, Rabio. Yeah, thank you. No, that's great. That's great backgrounds for this discussion. So I'm going through, we've got some excellent questions in the chat. So we'll just kick it off with, I think a good place to start is, can you walk through an example or a real world kind of scenario that you've been part of in which you worked with a landlord or property owner, property management company to really successfully secure housing for refugees or newcomers? And just start there, just a kind of an experience that you had that was successful and maybe some things that made that possible.
Sure. I'll start when I was doing housing, and still the same at IRC. We need to make sure that even staff that are working with refugees, since every year we receive different population, we are educated so about the population we are serving. So the background on these refugees that are coming, they send it to us first. We study it, and then we go and explain to landlords not only about the refugees, but also about the status of refugees. A lot of people here, when you ask them who's a refugee, they don't know how they end up here. And then Joshua mentioned it. There are very vetted before they enter even in the US. And then we tell them also it's a two-way street. So we educate not only the landlords, but also refugees themselves about how to live in these apartments. And as you may know, there are rural refugees and refugees that are coming from cities. So some of them, they don't need housing orientation. Oh, all of them, they will need a housing orientation. But for those that are coming from a rural area, we do have volunteers that will stay longer with them, and then teaching them about how to use all these amenities.
I'd also like to add that, it's important that you have great working relationships with agencies such as the IRC. They are very important to us. We have established relationships. That's where we get most of our referrals from for our tenants. Rabio sits on our board, so I think that's another good suggestion, is to make sure that you involve the other agencies in what you're doing, and it just really helps have a successful transition for their tenants. So it really helps to understand where they're coming from, and Rabio really puts he does that quite well for us.
Okay, great. Yeah. All right. So kind of move in a same direction, but just in general, what advice would you have with your background and expertise, both of you, for case managers in doing outreach? And there's a bunch of questions in the chat about kind of just that initial relationship building with landlords and meeting them where they're at. What advice would you have for a case manager who's saying, how do I kind of develop a strategy in communicating with landlords? What would be some advice that you'd have?
I think it's important to make sure that those case managers are there a lot in the beginning to make sure they can provide the support that the tenants need. We have resident services in our apartment complexes, so we have employees who go there to talk with the tenants and ask them what their needs are. We're not here to just throw out programs to them. We really want to know and hear from them what's important to them and what programs they think would make them more successful renters.
Okay, I would like to add again, education. It's very important for landlords, but also for case managers, because we realize that it's an important thing for IRC. I do know for the last 5 years, we used to have one housing person, but today we have a team of housing people that are working at IRC for our office. It's very important because we want to be prompt in our response if there is any call from a landlord, because I know in the past we used to have one person in housing, and then once they call, a complaint is they do not return our phone calls. So we do have a team right now just to take care of housing, because you don't want to burn the bridges. Once you do it, it's almost impossible to get back to it. So
Yeah, and I do know, I know several resettlement agencies are, have staff dedicated to housing, and we find that
yes,
having that kind of focus really makes a huge difference, so that you're addressing issues when they are just coming up, as opposed to waiting to where they're a huge problem. So that is something that it's good to hear as kind of a best practice, is to have staff who are dedicated to that housing, because it's kind of such a time-intensive process. Okay, great.
if I might
Yeah,
add,
Fabio,
I
yeah.
think in addition to staff, we do have volunteers as well, dedicated to the housing team. I mean by that, other people, they might need a longer orientation than just 5 days or something. So these people, we assign them volunteers to teach them also how to use uh, things in apartment, like microwave, stove, and then yeah.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm just going into the chat, and it's great. People are just, I should have said this, but you can thumbs up questions in the chat so we can see kind of which are the most kind of relevant. And there's a lot that have a bunch of thumbs up. So we'll start getting into these. And the first one is, and these are tough questions, so I'll just, we'll do our best. But how can we communicate with landlords who are concerned that making an effort to rent to refugees is giving them an unfair advantage over other renters? So how do you build a communication strategy around that? Because I know that that's something that sometimes can be an issue.
Okay, if I can say something, I do know in your first poll, a lot of them are concerned about the rent being paid on time. So if it's an important thing for them, I would like to reassure them that it's very important for our agency as well, because once they come here, these people that are enrolled in cash assistance as well as English classes. So up to a year, so they will receive their check directly from the agency on time at the first of every month. So this will not be an issue once they rent to refugees. The second one, or I would say the first one, refugees are vetted by before even they enter into the USA. I think through FBI, CIA, and any other security organization. So to make sure that these people that we are bringing in, we keep also America safe. So there are highly vetted. The rent will go directly to the landlord at the first of every month. And I would say also the orientation that we provide to them, and that are loyal once they rent. Michael can testify. I think they stay longer once they move, is to go back to go and pay their house. So
Right. And I think it's important that you educate. We are the owners of our complexes and we have a third party property management company, but I think it's very important that you educate your management company on the importance of renting to anyone that's under, we have income restricted, so it's anybody less than 60% of area median income can rent. And I just, like Rabio said, uh, his people come fully vetted, so we don't have to worry about because they don't have, maybe they don't have credit or rental history, but I do know that they've been vetted so well that we know that they're going to be good tenants. And to be honest, I think our refugee populations are probably the ones that pay their rent on time most often.
Okay, great. And yeah, those are great answers. And also I'm watching the chat and I have a quick comment, but there was a link that was posted in the chat to HUD's as far as refugees having advantage over non-refugees in rental. It's the case manager. The way I see it would be reframing the conversation to say resettlement agencies are supporting refugees, but they're not being given priority. So you're not necessarily looking for kind of any sort of special incentive from a landlord. What you're doing, you're trying to meet the landlord where they're at. So, and there is a link to the HUD website where HUD specifically says that something around this, that you're not looking for a specific country of origin based kind of, special conditions. It's about supporting the refugee household, just navigate the housing market. So, but excellent question. Okay. Let's see. So there's a lot of good ones here. All right, here's the next one. So how can I develop a relationship to convince, or I would say work with, corporate or large management companies to rent to refugees? This is something we hear often in our technical assistance sessions, is that oftentimes the larger management companies have very rigid requirements for leasing. So any ideas of how to develop that relationship and kind of work with larger corporate management companies and renting?
I think, once again, it's really important to let those larger companies know that these tenants are fully vetted, that they're coming to you almost pre-qualified to move in. So you have your job as the property manager is almost done when they walk in your door because they've been vetted. So I think it's just very important to make sure that they understand that, number one, these are people just like everybody else we rent to. And number two, they do have a slight advantage because they've been vetted already. So I think it's very important to establish that point, that These people are just as deserving of an affordable unit as anyone.
So what I would like to add, I think for not renting to refugees, most of the time I notice that people, they don't know who these people are. And but with education, and then I don't think we have the time right now to show, they don't have a proof to show that, hey, I'm fully vetted. I think the proof that they have the refugee status, and then it will be uh, easier to convince. I think we have at IRC, we have a presentation called Refugee 101 that describe who are refugees and then how they get here, and then the process they go through to come here. This vetting process, I think I want you to understand, it's not something that goes in 1 month, 2 months. It might take up to 2 years and sometimes more than that before they come here. So that's thing alone. I believe it's enough to show how refugees are vetted. And then I think maybe it might be the next step of the presentation, how refugees are getting the vetting of the refugee processing, if it's important for you to understand it. So uh,
Yeah, thanks, Robbie. I would definitely agree with that. Is that part of when we talk about communication strategy, to your point, is that it's not just saying that they're vetted, but it's explaining that it's the vetting process, how the depth of that and how long it takes. And it's not just a verification, but an in-depth investigation into that refugee status. So I think it's a good thing to kind of build that case. Also, one thing that I just wanted to add is that, because this is something that we hear often from case managers that are finding this to be a challenge, and something that we've heard, and I think this is a strategy to kind of navigate working with the large property management companies. This is probably not going to be as impactful with a smaller number of units or an individual landlord, but oftentimes we found that there's usually a front office, or there's somebody that you're kind of dealing with who is part of, it's a corporate employee, and oftentimes they have very rigid kind of restrictions on, they're very much looking to see, is the box checked for that document. If there's no document, then you kind of hit a stone wall as far as accessing those units. What we found as a strategy is to actually connect to a manager or someone at a director level at that property management company, because oftentimes, you're asking someone to maybe kind of look outside the box when their job is to not look outside the box. So sometimes, not necessarily saying I want to talk to your boss or something, but say, we'd like to have a more of an in-depth discussion with a manager or a director at that property management company. This works well with the corporate level, because oftentimes there will be a willingness at that level. And also, this is something we've seen great success with, is that if you can get past that first hurdle, oftentimes those corporate landlord and leasing kind of units will work with you, and oftentimes there are multiple units that are available. So it's kind of worth that time to invest, and not necessarily take that first no as an answer, but maybe go a little bit further into that corporate kind of structure and see if there's someone who has the ability or the authority to kind of understand what's needed to have these refugees come into the building. So that's just something I've heard work. Not easy. It's not going to work every time, but that's a strategy that could be useful. Okay, great. So we got another good question here. And Rabio, this might be one for you, but the most common question, this is from the chat. The most common question we receive from potential new landlord partners is, what happens after the rent support from your agency ends and the tenant and if the tenant is still not working? How would you recommend responding to this? It's a tough question, but
yeah. So remember, the role of the resettlement agency is to make every refugee that arrives here make him self-sufficient. So within a year, so they can start taking care of themselves. So we have up to 1 year to provide English classes, job classes, and then after that, it's the job. So what happened if the person is not able to get a job within 1 year? So there are several things that might happen if it's a health issues. Yes, that person, I think that's why we have private funding and that we support these people beyond their cash assistance. If it's, let's say, it's something that happened and then an accident, it might take him 3 months, and then after that he will go to work. Our goal is to find them a job. So that's what I would like to say. It's not happening all the time, but few cases. In few cases, it might happen, and then we do have some private funding to support those people. Not in long term though. So, and Boise also has a different organization. We connect them with outside resources that help with rental.
Okay, great. Michael, I don't know if you wanted to weigh in on that one or.
No, I'm good. Thanks.
Okay, great. Yeah, I was just going to add, I mean, again, to echo what Rabio was saying, just that how important the kind of economic development and livelihood component of the resettlement process is. What I would suggest, and it's not necessarily an easy answer, but to me, this is where the strength of that relationship really comes into play, is that we found that if it's the first time that you're speaking to that landlord and you have no history as a resettlement agency or case manager with that landlord, then yeah, that is going to be a hurdle when they start asking questions about, how is this rent going to be paid long term? However, what I think a different way to look at it would be, this is building those relationships with that landlord. If that landlord knows the 3 refugees that have kind of access units from that landlord have been successful and have paid rent on time, for the past 2 years, that conversation is going to be of a different kind of tenor. So I would say the first thing is to really build that relationship and maintain those good relationships. And then some of those questions won't be as difficult to manage. So not a great answer, but I would say that would be something to keep in mind. Okay, great. So Christine here asks, do a lot of people have MOUs? And this is something that, so I would say just very briefly, this is something that I would say is not widespread, the use of MOUs, but I would say increasingly it's something that we've seen work. And I would say most importantly about expectation setting. Oftentimes by the time that we're doing technical assistance with case managers, when things have kind of broken down, oftentimes it's that different people have different ideas of who was going to be responsible for what, who's going to maintain the unit, what happens if rent is late, or, just having those, I would say, MOU, but more of the memorandum of agreement. So just expectation setting and getting things in writing, even if it's not a legally binding document. Obviously, it's not a lease. The other thing we found very beneficial in those documents is to have someone, even if they just initial, right? And say, I'm responsible for this. So not, like I said, nothing legally binding, but just so that down, when things are kind of, months downstream, you can kind of say, go back to that document and say, hey, this is something that we agreed to. And oftentimes that mitigates any sort of, negative outcome. But I don't know, Rabio, Michael, I just wanted to mention that one. Okay, here's our next question. How do you cut through when a housing market this is something actually I think with Boise is relevant. How do you cut through in a housing market when you have more renters than landlords and there's a shortage of hold on, I'm reading this wrong. So how do you cut through when a housing market with excess renters and landlords aren't having a shortage of potential renters? Okay, so more renters so shortage of housing stock. How do you work in a market where there's a shortage of housing availability? And what are some strategies around that? Because I know that's happening in Boise.
Yes, I think we did talk again. I think it's building relationship. We have a good relationship with some hotels here in Boise, and we talk to them. So when the refugees arrive, we are able to house them in these hotels until they get a permanent housing. So this is one strategy. And then another one, I think people are talking, it's just to take US tie cases. Like if you have family members, so it will be easier. At least they can stay with you and then they can help with housing. For those who do not have, we house them in the hotels. And then again, recently Boise had a whole hotel that was dedicated for only refugees when they arrive. So this is again, I think it's a relation building relationship, talking to them. So
We've partnered with other agencies, nonprofits that are dealing with refugees. Welcome Housing is one of them, and they do house people in hotels until there are available units available. In Boise, I would say in Ada County, we have a shortage of 32,000 units to what we have out there with those that are eligible for our services. So it is very tough for anyone to get housing when there's that much of a shortage. But definitely when talking about the refugees, there are several hotels in town, as Revu pointed out, that do take in refugees while they're waiting to find a unit.
Okay, great. Yeah. And one thing I'll add to that is something that we found, because again, oftentimes we're hearing from case managers or who are in very competitive housing markets, oftentimes in kind of large metro areas. And something that, and again, it's not easy, but something else that works is, and I think sometimes as resettlement agencies and case managers, we can kind of become siloed. And when I would see a solution to really bring in, and this is to kind of Michael and Ravio's point, is bring in more nonprofits, make those connections with others who are maybe not necessarily resettlement specific agencies, but are very much interested and have very similar missions in supporting people accessing housing. So, you know, there's a huge nationwide network of affordable housing organizations that would be very interested in providing support. So you think, you know, Habitat for Humanity, organizations like that, local affordable housing nonprofits, bring them into this process. If there's a very competitive market, the idea that you're going to have to find units and you're going to find landlords and property managers that are a little bit outside of what normally you would find when you're just kind of searching for housing. So I would say part of the answer is to actually bring in more community stakeholders into this, get more people involved. And also, you know, one thing also is faith-based community, you know, all of the faith-based organizations, oftentimes there's a lot of units that are available. I wouldn't say a lot. Sometimes there's units that are available that maybe aren't being marketed to the broader community. And sometimes you can find through faith-based organizations and you know, that sort of thing, find units and people who are open to renting refugees. This is something that's not theoretical. This is actually things that we've actually heard. It's more anecdotal, but there are ways around this, but it's very competitive housing market in many of those large metro areas. So,
And we do have 247 other NeighborWorks organizations throughout the country. So I would definitely look in your area to see if there is a NeighborWorks affiliate and contact them and see, you know, how they have their tenants set up, selection process set up, and if they do rent to refugees. So I would definitely check that out. NeighborWorks America is our parent company.
yeah, and definitely. And what we'll do is we'll do a follow-up email to everyone who's registered for the webinar, and we can provide a lot of links, including the NeighborWorks and resources that are provided there. So we'll definitely follow up with that. Okay, great. So along that same kind of strategy and working, we've got. So maybe, okay, so this is similar, but so from a case manager's perspective, Often landlords are hesitant to rent to specifically people with no credit. So this is something that we hear often. So when there's no credit history, do you have any suggestions on how a case manager can work? So maybe you've got a landlord or a property management company that says, okay, we're open to having this discussion, but the fact is there's no credit score. And how do you kind of bridge that gap or work with them on that?
Okay. One thing I would like to say, refugees that are human beings, and then they just need to understand how they end up here. So these are people because they came here because of war, or so they have to leave their country and they cannot go back. They had everything. Some of them, they have job, house, and then stable situation, and then boom, the work broke, and then they ended up here. One thing I would say, yes, they do not have credit history. Someone just mentioned it in the chat. They are highly motivated to work and then to take care of their families. So this is one thing they need to know, and then especially what the agencies are doing for them towards that goal. So once they come, it's not that they are just sitting around. We provide English classes, I said, and then some of them within the job market right now, it's very high in Boise, as far as I know. So once they come, within 3 months, they all have a job. And uh, so as soon as they get that thing, I think they will start building a credit history. Again, that are loyal, they will stay there for a long time. And then when you see them move, it's when they go and buy their houses. So motivation, I would say they don't have credit history, but they do have motivation.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Rabio. And I also see it as, and I think you did a very good job of, we're creating a narrative around this, right? So it's not that they have a bad credit history, they have no credit history, but for a good reason. And that they don't, they're a refugee, they're coming to the country, and they haven't had an opportunity to even build a credit score. So and again, I think creating that narrative and it kind of explaining why the situation is the way it is, I think goes a long way. Another thing that I've seen work is rather than take it as a no, say what sort of documentation or what could you accept, being that this person, that this refugee does not have a credit score. So put it back on them and say, what would you be willing to accept? Would it be proof of employment? Would it like what? Just kind of put it back to them and say, how can we make this work? Because I think one of the things with the credit score is that it's kind of a non-starter with a lot, especially with corporate landlord or leasing agencies. And I think that, again, same thing, maybe going up a little bit the chain, like I mentioned earlier, to see if you find somebody with some authority to make some exceptions. But yeah, it's a difficult one. But I think, to Rabio's point, creating that narrative and explaining why the situation is the way it is, and that having no credit history is different than having a bad credit history. I think sometimes we equate the two, but there's a very big difference there. And I think you've explained it to somebody, I think most people will kind of, oh yeah, that makes sense. But I think it takes some explanation, and it's not something that's really going to come across in an application form.
Yes, I agree. And I think it's important just to make sure you are working with an affordable housing agency, because that's what they do. So I would say establish relationships with anyone that provides affordable housing, and just talk to them and let them know but your whole process and how those people got to where they are, and that they've been vetted. And I think you will alleviate some of those worries.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And again, NeighborWorks and other affordable housing organizations are just this is where they shine. This is what they do. And I think sometimes, to my point earlier, is that as resettlement agencies, I sometimes think we think that in very much a siloed approach with housing as a part of that resettlement process. And there might be a local affordable housing organization like a NeighborWorks or a Habitat for Humanity that has entire staff dedicated to building credit history and, you know, kind of financial literacy and working in that housing space. So really, I would say bringing more stakeholders into that to expand your organizational capacity. And even it's to the point where you say, oh, I know I have a resource now that I can call and ask about this, you know, sometimes that makes all the difference. Okay, great. All right, so maybe one last question. Let's see, there's a lot of great ones here. I feel it's tough to choose. Okay, so this last one. So, you know, just as far, and maybe we can end on this one. So Michael and Rabio, so if you were to say in kind of like a final kind of statement, you know, just how to approach working with landlords and what sort of perspective a case manager or resettlement agency should have to really set the stage for an optimal outcome for the refugee or newcomer. So just kind of how an approach or just kind of like we said, we've been talking about communication strategy, but you know, if you were to just kind of give some advice, what would it be?
Okay, I would say, especially for a new landlord who has never seen refugees or an immigrant. So one thing I would say, be prompt in your response, and as well as education. I think educating landlord, but also the refugees, it's very important to keep your relationship with that person and maintaining the relationship with the landlord.
I would say share success stories of previous tenants, you know, come with ammunition of, you know, here is a story of, you know, a refugee who came, they rented, they're employed, they were successful. I think, you know, showing that it's you're able to do that, I think is very important. You know, just share some success stories of what you've done in the past with refugees.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, great. So we'll leave it there. And thanks, Rabio and Michael, for your time. It was super appreciate all of the answers to the questions. There are some tough ones in there. Like I said, so we'll wrap it up. So I would say hopefully we have some takeaways from today. And you know, we're going to send this PowerPoint presentation and the recorded lecture to everyone who's registered. So you know, use the strategies that we had earlier in the PowerPoint. Recall, you know, there are steps toward this becoming something that's successful. So really break down the challenges into those manageable steps. And there are a lot of resources available. So I think a couple slides we'll talk about some of those resources, but don't feel like there aren't options out there for you. And just like Michael said, you know, there are a lot of affordable housing organizations, NeighborWorks being an excellent one. So don't feel like there isn't support there. Okay, great. So our learning objectives that we started with was to explain the benefits of helping newcomers and refugees build good landlord-tenant relationships, name the steps for identifying and establishing those collaborative partnerships that will develop or expand landlord relationships, and apply these insights to affordable housing through the discussion with affordable housing experts and cultivate those landlord relationships. Okay, great. All right, so now we're going to wrap it up. We've got a 3-question survey. It will take less than 30 seconds for you to fill out. We really appreciate if you could do this. I think the link should be dropped in the, okay, great. So I don't know. So yeah, but I would really appreciate if everyone could fill out the survey. We use this to really address these webinars and make them the most impactful and useful use of your time. So this would be very helpful if everyone could fill it out. I'll give everyone just 30 seconds to do that. Okay, and then yeah, recommended resources. So as Michael mentioned, we've got NeighborWorks America's link here. There's a lot of great work that's been done at Switchboard and Refugee Housing Solutions as far as downloadable resources. There is another webinar just like this that we did with Michael Horvath from HUD, talking about how HUD works with refugees and what their role is. So that's another webinar I would take a look at. Any sort of housing technical assistance that you require, if you are funded by ORR, if you work in the resettlement space, resettlement agencies, or any sort of nonprofit that works, please go to Switchboard. You can fill out a TA request. When you fill out a technical assistance request at Switchboard, if you click that link and you click on housing, that goes right to Refugee Housing Solutions inbox. That's me and the team. And we will get, within 24 hours, we will get back to you, and we will set up a virtual technical assistance session where we spend at first an hour really understanding what your challenge is and helping you build a solution. So that's a real resource that's available to everyone who's on this call. So I'd really encourage you to follow up. And then finally, like I said, there's here are the links for both Switchboard TA and Refugee Housing Solutions. Thanks so much to everybody for your hour. We hope it was helpful. Thanks again to Michael and Rabio. Really enjoyed hearing your insights into this space. And thanks so much, everyone. And like I said, we'll follow up with all these resources in an email, along with the recording and the PowerPoint. So thanks so much, everybody, and have a good day.
Take care.